Among the administrative tablets recovered from the ruins of ancient Greece, modern Tello, one particular document stands apart, not because of its age or its condition, but because of what it records with such bureaucratic The tablet, catalogued as part of the early dynastic III period, and dating to roughly 2,600 years before the Common Era, lists quantities of bread, beer, mutton, and oil. It specifies amounts in precise units. It names recipients. It bears the seal of a temple administrator. In every formal respect, it resembles thousands of other economic documents from the same archive. But the recipients named in careful wedge strokes are not workers, not priests, not royal officials. Tearagots, the text, does not explain why gods require bread. It does not justify the buyer rations. It does not frame the mutton as symbolic or the oil as metaphorical. The scribe who pressed the stylus into wet clay recorded the transaction as he would record any other distribution from temple stores. 10 loaves of barley bread to Ning, 3 jugs of date beatubao, a shoulder of mutton to Shulshaga. The weights are standard. The containers are familiar. The food itself is identical to what temple workers received on the same day, differing only in quantity and in the status of those who are meant to consume it. What the tablet does not contain is as significant as what it does. There is no preamble explaining divine nature, no invocation, no theological justification for why beings described elsewhere as sources of cosmic order would need the same nourishment that sustained human laborers. The text treats the feeding of gods as an operational matter, a task within the regular flow of temple economy. The gods in this record appear not as distant powers, but as residents with needs that must be met through the same supply chains, the same storage facilities, the same distribution networks that fed everyone else in the temple household. Other tablets from Gursu and from sites across southern Mesopotamia repeat this pattern. Add your offering lists, specify cuts of beef and types of fish for an Enlil and Eng at Lagash. Daily ration text, allocate grain, onions, and clarified butter. To divine statues housed in temple chambers. At Nippur, the archive of the Enlil temple contains hundreds of documents tracking flour, dates, and dairy products moved from storerooms to cult spaces. In each case, the language is administrative. The gods are treated as dependents of the institution, entitled to regular provisions. Their consumption recorded with the same attention given to human personnel. The quantities themselves follow recognizable patterns. A god of higher rank receives more. A minor deity receives less. The proportions mirror the hierarchies visible in human ration distributions, where a temple overseer received more than a laborer, a priest more than an attendant. The divine ration system does not operate outside human economic logic. It extends that logic upward. The Anunnaki, at least as they appear in these mundane lists, eat within the same framework of measure and allocation that govern mortal life. One text from the Year 3 period, recovered from the archives at Puzurishtagan, takes the accounting further. It records not only what was given to the gods, but what was returned. Bread offered in the morning was sometimes redistributed to temple staff in the evening after it had been placed before the divine image. The beer poured for the deity was later consumed by priests. The meat presented at the altar became the meal of temple officials. The gods, it seems, did not diminish the physical substance of their offerings. The food remained. What changed, according to the implied ritual logic, was not the material but its status. It had been consecrated by proximity to the divine presence, then returned to human use. This relation raises a question that the texts themselves do not address directly. If the gods did not consume the substance of the food, what did they consume? The tablets offer no answer, only the continuous record of provision. Day after day, season after season, the offerings were made. The bread was baked. The beer was brewed. The animals were slaughtered. The oil was pressed. All of it moved through the same economic apparatus that sustained the temple workforce, the royal court, the urban population. The gods were woven into the distributive economy of the city, not as external recipients of tribute, but as embedded participants, whose needs were anticipated, measured, and met through institutional routine. What makes these records difficult to categorize is their refusal to distinguish between practical and sacred. The tablet that lists bread for Ningasu does not shift into a different register when naming the god. The scribe does not pause to note that this transaction differs in kind from others. The divine and the human share the same grammar of need and provision. The Anunnaki, at least in the archive, live within the same household economy that structures all dependent relationships in the city. They are fed as a king is fed, as a priestess is fed, as a worker is fed, differing only in rank and portion size, not in the fundamental nature of the relationship. The banquet lists do not tell us what the Sumerians believed about divine nature in any abstract sense. They tell us what the Sumerians did. They fed their gods with the same foods they fed themselves. They managed divine consumption through the same bureaucratic methods they used to manage human consumption. They treated the sustenance of the Anunnaki as a task that required planning, labor, resource extraction, and the texts describe a world in which gods and humans exist within a shared economy of dependence and provision. If the gods needed to eat, did they also need to be housed, clothed, and cared for in other ways? And if the needs so closely mirrored human needs, what does that suggest about the origin of those patterns? The physical infrastructure that supported the divine diet can still be traced in the ruins themselves. When excavators working at Nippur reached the temple complex of Enlil during the early 20th century, they found more than shrines and altars. They uncovered rooms with thick deposits of ash, charred animal bones, and the remains of large ceramic vessels designed for storage and transport. One chamber adjacent to the main cella contained what the excavation reports described as evidence of burning and food preparation, on a scale that went beyond ritual symbolism. The temple, in its Yo3 phase, appears to have functioned in part as what the archaeological literature now calls the kitchen temple, a facility where the feeding of the god was not merely commemorated but physically performed. The layout itself suggests logistics. Courtyards opened into spaces with hearths and fire installations, where heat could be controlled and contained. Storage rooms held jars large enough to contain grain, oil, and beer in quantities sufficient for weeks of offerings. There were spaces for butchering, areas where grinding stones were found in clusters, and evidence of bread ovens built into the walls of secondary chambers. The architecture does not separate sacred from functional. The god's house, at least in its material form, required the same facilities that any large household needed to produce meals at scale: kitchens, storerooms, workspaces where raw materials could be transformed into edible form. At Uruk, the ENA precinct dedicated to Inanna shows similar traces. Early dynastic levels of the temple complex included rooms identified as food preparation areas, with offering tables, benches, and altars situated within a larger network of courtyards and workshops equipped with fireplaces. The shrines where the goddess received her offerings were embedded in a broader operational structure. The divine image resided in one part of the complex. The food that sustained that image was prepared in another. The two were connected by a flow of labor and material that left its signature in the archaeological record as ash layers, discarded animal bones, and the heavy wear patterns on grinding stones. The bones themselves are informative. Faunal analysis from temple sites across southern Mesopotamia reveals concentrations of sheep, goat, and cattle remains in contexts associated with cult activity. The animals were not symbolic abstractions. They were slaughtered, butchered, and processed using the same techniques applied in any other context where meat needed to be prepared for consumption. Cut marks on bone indicate dismemberment at standard joints. Burning patterns suggest roasting or boiling. The remains found in temple kitchens are indistinguishable from those found in residential or palatial contexts, except in their sheer volume and their proximity to divine spaces. The gods, it seems, ate meat that had been handled, cooked, and presented according to ordinary methods. Beer production, too, left material traces. Large ceramic jars with residue consistent with fermentation have been recovered from temple storerooms at multiple sites. Brewing required consistent access to barley, water, and controlled fermentation conditions. Tablets from the Year 3 period reference brewers attached to temple households, specialists whose labor was directed toward producing the beer rations allocated to divine recipients. One text from Pazarishtagan, a redistribution center for livestock and goods destined for temples, records deliveries of barley, specifically designated for brewing beer for the gods of Nippur. The brewing itself took place within the temple economy, using the same ingredients and techniques that produced beer for human consumption, differing only in the intended recipient and the ritual context of its offering. The same administrative logic extended to bread. Texts describe temple bakers producing loaves in standardized sizes and types. Some tablets distinguish between coarse bread, fine bread, bread made with oil, and bread made with milk. The variety suggests attention not only to quantity but to quality and type, as though the gods had preferences, or at least as though those responsible for their care assumed such preferences. The ovens where this bread was baked could still be identified in excavated temple complexes, their interiors blackened from repeated use, their positions within the site plan indicating integration into the broader rhythm of daily offerings. Oil, too, required processing infrastructure. Sesame oil, a staple of Mesopotamian offerings, was produced by pressing seeds in specialized installations. Though direct evidence of oil presses within temples is less common, tablets frequently mention oil deliveries to temple households, and the storage jars designed to hold oil are found in temple storerooms alongside those for grain and beer. The oil used to anoint divine statues, to fuel lamps in cult chambers, and to accompany food offerings moved through the same supply chains that provided oil for cooking, lighting, and medicine in other contexts. What the kitchens reveal is a system the gods did not materialize their food. It was grown in fields managed by temple estates, harvested by laborers whose rations were recorded on the same kinds of tablets that recorded divine offerings, transported to temple storerooms, processed in temple kitchens, and presented in temple shrines. Every stage of this process left evidence: the residue in jars, the bones in middens, the ashen hearths, the wear on grinding stones. The divine household, at least as it functioned on the ground, was a material operation embedded in the larger economy of the city. The offerings were not occasional. They were daily, sometimes multiple times per day. Morning and evening meals are mentioned in ritual calendars. Festivals brought additional offerings, larger quantities, special preparations. The logistical burden of maintaining this flow required planning, labor coordination, and resource allocation on a scale that shaped the entire economic structure of the temple institution. The gods, in effect, were permanent dependents, whose needs drove a significant portion of temple activity and employment. If the preparation of divine meals required such infrastructure, what did the spaces where the gods actually resided look like, and how were those spaces maintained? The rooms set aside for the gods themselves rarely declare their purpose in stone. Yet, their arrangement suggests how a divine resident was expected to live within the temple. At the center of many major complexes lies a sequence of spaces moving inward from open courts through narrower corridors into a restricted chamber. In plans reconstructed from sites like Nippur, Ur, and Uruk, this innermost room is often slightly raised, sometimes equipped with a niche or podium, and aligned along a deliberate axis. The architecture implies a destination, a place where a cult statue stood, where the movement of people and provisions converged but did not linger. In royal inscriptions, these spaces are described with domestic language. Kings record that they built the house of a deity, established its dining room, or furnished its bedchamber, even when the excavated remains look to modernize like a modest cella with an altar and a small back room. The terms used suggest that the divine presence was imagined not as an abstraction, but as a household member with designated rooms. The innermost chamber, where few humans entered, was treated as the resident's private space. The adjoining halls and courtyards supported the activities required to maintain that residence. At Ur, the ziggurat complex, dedicated to Nana, was surrounded by a network of buildings that included what later scholars call a residence for the high priestess. Yet inscriptions and foundation deposits make clear that these structures were also understood as part of the goddess household. The deity's sleeping place and sitting place are mentioned in the same breath as the storage of offerings and the performance of rites. The gods' living quarters were, in effect, nested within a human-managed estate. The housing of the Anunnaki overlapped with the housing of those who served them. Yet the texts maintain a distinction. One set of rooms belonged to the god by name. In Gudya's inscriptions from Gurisa, the ruler describes receiving instructions in a dream on how to build Ningasu's temple. He reports that the god indicated precise dimensions and specified the inclusion of particular features. A throne, doorways framed with copper, doors hung on gold-plated pivots. The language is careful, almost technical, focusing on measurements, materials, and fittings. The result, as Gudea presents it, is a structure that could properly accommodate the god's presence. The temple is not a symbolic replica of a cosmic order. It is, in the ruler's own terms, a correctly furnished dwelling, outfitted to a set of inherited specifications. Excavations of such temples often reveal small side rooms, branching off from the main shrine. Some contain benches and low platforms, others evidence of storage. A few include installations that may have functioned as bases for beds or couches. While direct identification is difficult, the pattern suggests that the divine resident's chamber was not isolated but connected to a series of ancillary spaces where clothing, ritual equipment, and perhaps even bedding were kept. The god's life, as imagined by builders and scribes, required more than a single pedestal. It required a sequence of rooms through which different aspects of care and service were organized. Foundation deposits, buried under floor levels or at the corners of walls, add another layer of information. Small objects, figurines, inscribed pegs, miniature tools were placed there at the time of construction, accompanied by texts stating that the king had secured the god's dwelling for long future days. These deposits were not visible once the building was complete. They functioned as a kind of architectural memory, encoding the initial moment when the god's house was established or renewed. The act of rebuilding, which many rulers describe, was framed not as innovation but as restoration of a proper dwelling that had fallen into disrepair. The vocabulary used in these records repeatedly emphasizes stability and comfort. Kings caused the god to dwell in a pure dwelling, made the heart of the god glad in his house, established cool shade in courtyards. The concern is practical as much as ceremonial. The temple must not leak. Its floors must not crumble. Its gates must not jam. The resident's comfort reflects directly on the king's competence. A well-kept, divine residence implies a correctly ordered city, just as a neglected one implies failure in stewardship. The condition of the god's house thus becomes a public index of the relationship between ruler, deity, and community. Where the archaeological record shows rebuildings, repairs, and changes in floor level, the texts often speak of renewing or returning the god to his or her proper dwelling. The assumption is that there is an ideal form to which each temple should conform, even if its materials and exact layout shift over time. Successive generations do not present themselves as inventing a new kind of building for the Anunnaki. They present themselves as re-establishing a known pattern, one that has been temporarily interrupted by flood, subsidence, or conflict. In this sense, the housing of the gods is treated as an inherited obligation rather than a creative project. Inside these spaces, the cult statue functioned as the focal point of divine residence. The statue was washed, anointed, clothed, and seated, as later chapters of the documentary will explore more closely. For now, its presence matters, because it anchors the notion of a lived interior. The rooms are not empty abstractions. They are designed around an image that was treated as an occupant. Movement in and out of the shrine by priests, by offerings, by music and incense stakes, on the character of service to one who is assumed to be resident. Even if rarely glimpsed, the combination of texts and architecture suggests a quiet but persistent idea that the gods lived in specific addresses, within buildings whose measurements, fittings, and maintenance were recorded and whose deterioration was seen as both a physical and a political problem. The Anunnaki, in this view, do not hover over cities in vague transcendence. They dwell within walls that can crack, floors that can shift, and roofs that must be renewed. Their presence is imagined through the same categories of shelter and comfort that structure human life. If the gods required such carefully planned and maintained housing, designed according to inherited templates and renewed across generations, how did those who served them understand the need to furnish and change what the gods wore within these same walls? Across many temple archives, textiles appear not as ornaments, but as regular line items, handled with the same precision as grain or oil. A tablet from the reign of Shulgi, for example, records the delivery of fine wool garments to the temple of Nana. At your listing by number and type, the piece is destined for the god alongside those assigned to singers, gatekeepers, and other personnel. The garments are differentiated. Some are described as thin, others as heavy, some as colored, others as undyed. The implication is not just that the god had clothes, but that those clothes formed a wardrobe with internal variety, calibrated to occasions and seasons in a way that quietly resembles human practice. The language used in these records is not symbolic. The same terms that describe a cloak given to a priest describe a cloak given to a deity. In festival lists, particular garments are assigned to particular days, with notes that a statue is to be clothed in new wool or clothed in bright linen. The act of dressing the god is treated as a scheduled obligation, integrated into the broader calendar of offerings. Nowhere do the texts pause to explain why a being described elsewhere as radiant and powerful would need woven cloth. Instead, they assume the need and focus on the logistics. Who weaves, who delivers, who is accountable for the textiles once they enter the temple's stores. Weaving itself was a major institutional activity. Large temple-based workshops employed many workers, often women, who produced textiles in bulk for both human and divine use. Administrative tablets track their output in terms of standardized garments and lengths of cloth, with some portions explicitly tagged for cult use. When a certain number of linen tunics for the gods leaves the workshop, another tablet registers their arrival at the temple's textile storeroom. The movement of cloth is thus mapped across the institutional landscape, from loom to shelf to shrine. The divine wardrobe is not an abstraction. It is a flow of counted objects under human management. Some texts highlight the quality of specific items destined for divine statues. Garments described as royal quality, embroidered, or decorated with precious metals appear in donation inscriptions, where rulers note that they have presented splendid clothing to their gods. The king does not claim to have invented a new style. Instead, he frames his act as a renewal or enhancement of what should already be present in the goddess house. The clothing is presented as appropriate, as aligning the god's visible appearance with an inherited standard of dignity. In these records, kingship and divinity share a visual language, and textiles are a primary medium through which that language is expressed. Colophons, on some accounts, reveal the concern for accountability. A tablet may end with a note stating that a particular priest or official is responsible for the garments listed, implying that loss or damage would be noticed and perhaps punished. The clothing of the gods is, in this administrative sense, temple property that must be preserved. Yet the same texts mention the periodic replacement of worn garments, especially at major festivals when statues were stripped, washed, and redressed. The wardrobe is thus both stable and dynamic. An inherited set of expected garments, renewed through cycles of wear and replacement. In ritual descriptions, the act of clothing the divine image often follows washing and anointing. The statue is bathed, perfumed with oil, and then dressed in clean textiles. While such sequences are known in more detail from later Mesopotamian sources, the underlying pattern appears already in earlier Sumerian practice. Purity, followed by adornment. The clothing, in this framework, is not mere covering. It is the visible completion of a process that restores the god to an appropriate state. The garments mark the statue as ready to receive offerings, to be present at the center of the temple household. Color and material carry quiet significance. References to blue or red-dyed cloth, to garments with gold thread borders, suggest that certain visual effects were reserved for divine use or for the highest-ranking cult personnel. To look upon the statue, clothed in such textiles, was to see a concentration of labor and material that surpassed what most inhabitants of the city would ever wear. In this way, the divine wardrobe crystallized the hierarchy, embedded in the broader economy. The best wool, the rarest dyes, the most carefully executed weaving converged on the figure of the god. Yet the same records that emphasize distinction also reveal overlap. The terminology used for the god's garments recurs in descriptions of royal and elite clothing. The same shapes of tunics and mantles appear across social levels, differing in fineness and embellishment, but not in basic form. If the Anunnaki are clothed like kings, and kings are clothed like especially honored humans, the boundary between divine and human attire blurs. The clothing of the gods might then be seen as an intensified version of human clothing, rather than a fundamentally different category. This continuity raises a quiet possibility. If the Sumerian scribes, administrators, and rulers responsible for outfitting divine statues thought in terms of replacement and repair, of seasons and festivals, of wear and prestige, they may have understood the clothing of the Anunnaki less as imaginative novelty, and more as a careful extension of known patterns. The garments they placed on the statues did not need an explanation because they already belonged to a familiar repertoire of what it meant to be housed. honored, and visible in the world they inhabited. If the gods ate what humans ate, and wore what humans wove, then how did those same scribes conceive of the tasks the Anunnaki themselves were said to perform within this shared framework of daily life? In the long Sumerian lists that scholars call god lists, the Anunnaki do not appear as a formless collective. Each name is followed by a function, a title, or an association that quietly assigns a task. Enlil is linked with command, Enki with crafts and subterranean waters, Nana with the regulation of night and time, Utu with justice and daylight. The tablets present these roles as established facts, not as stories in need of elaboration. To the scribes who copied them, the work of the gods seems to have been as fixed and as taken for granted as the offices of human administrators. Administrative texts echo this division of labor in subtle ways. Offerings are sometimes described as for the judging of cases, for the watching of the night, or for the securing of canals, formulas that align specific deities with specific functions in the maintenance of the city and its surroundings. When a temple of a particular god receives barley for the protection of the boundary, or oil for the purification of the river, the implication is that the god resident there is held responsible for that aspect of life. The provisioning of the deity thus corresponds not only to rank but also to a defined sphere of activity, almost like a department within a larger system. Liturgical compositions reinforce this sense of specialization. Hymns to Enlil praise him as the one who decides destinies, to whom kings appeal when establishing their authority. Hymns to Enki enumerate skills and crafts under his oversight: brickmaking, metalworking, canal-digging, treating him as the patron of technical knowledge embedded in daily labor. In these texts, the divine tasks are not distant abstractions, but mirror images of the structured activities that sustain urban life. Judging disputes, planning construction, allocating water. The gods appear to operate at a higher level in the same framework that organizes human work. Caliph and Zonsam, hymn tablets note that there were 4 recitation in the house of the god on particular days. This situates the description of divine duties within the ongoing routine of cult performance. The priests reciting these texts did so in the immediate vicinity of the statue, in a building where food was being prepared and garments stored. As earlier chapters have noted, the words spoken about the goddess' tasks were thus part of the same environment in which the god was fed and housed. The Anunnaki's workday was not imagined apart from their domestic arrangements. It was articulated from within the administrative and ritual spaces that supported their presence. There are also texts that portray gods complaining about the burden of labor, especially in compositions that describe a time before humans existed. In these accounts, the gods are shown performing tasks such as digging canals, maintaining fields, or carrying bricks. Tasks later assigned to human beings. The language used is prosaic. The work is described in terms familiar from economic documents: carrying loads, measuring fields, clearing irrigation channels. The divine complaint is not framed as a mythic drama so much as a problem of workload distribution, resolved when humans are introduced to assume those duties. Once humans take over the heavy labor, the tasks of the Anunnaki shift in these compositions. They move from direct physical work to supervision, command, and consumption. They appoint overseers, issue decisions, and receive the products of human effort in the form of offerings. The pattern resembles the differentiation that economic texts show between laborers, foremen, and high officials within the temple estate. The gods occupy the upper tier of this hierarchy. Their workday consists of receiving reports, making determinations, and enjoying the benefits of the system they oversee. Calendar texts hint at the rhythm of this divine activity. Certain days are marked out for the decision of fates, others for hearing of petitions, others for inspection or cleansing of particular places. On Tosa days, additional offerings are directed to the gods responsible for those functions, and specific rituals are performed in their presence. The schedule implies that the gods' tasks are not constant in intensity, but follow a patterned sequence, with periods of intensified attention corresponding to moments when the community formally presents issues or seeks reassurance. The divine work is thus imagined as cyclical, aligned with both agricultural and civic time. The language of service that appears in many texts flows in 2 directions. On one hand, humans are described as servants of the god, bound to carry out the cult and maintain the god's house. On the other hand, some compositions describe gods attending on higher deities, performing duties within a divine hierarchy. Lesser gods act as messengers, gatekeepers, or attendants to greater ones. The structure closely parallels the layered personnel lists in human institutions, where lower-ranking officials serve higher-ranking ones and also serve the king. The Anunnaki, in this sense, inhabit a world of work, organized along lines that scribes and administrators knew well. In god lists and explanatory texts, certain deities are explicitly linked with specific cities, canals, or fields. A god may be called lord of a particular gate, street, or district. This vocabulary suggests territorial jurisdiction. The tasks of such gods would include watching over those bounded spaces, ensuring their safety, fertility, or order. For the scribes who recorded and repeated these titles, the distribution of divine responsibilities appears to have mapped directly onto the political and economic geography of their world. The gods' work coincided with the shape of the city and its hinterland. Yet the texts also preserve a sense of inherited arrangement. Lists of gods and their functions are copied and recopied with relatively little alteration over long periods. When changes do occur, when a new deity is elevated or a function reassigned, they are incorporated into the existing framework rather than replacing it. The order of names, the established connections between deity and duty, are treated as a legacy that later generations must learn and transmit. The divine division of labor, like the physical layout of temples, is thus framed as something received rather than invented. To the scribes sitting in tablet-filled rooms, copying these lists and hymns, the work of the Anunnaki would have appeared as a structured network of responsibilities, as regular and as patterned as their own assignments. Their texts imply that the gods' tasks were woven into the same fabric of scheduling, hierarchy, and obligation that governed human institutions. If the Anunnaki's workday was imagined so closely on the model of human labor and administration, what happened to this framework when the continuity of offerings and service was broken by catastrophe or disruption? Some Sumerian compositions describe catastrophe not only in terms of water and ruin, but in terms of interruption. When the flood rises in texts like the Sumerian versions of the AntikeSpuren tradition and the Eridu narratives, the language lingers on the silence that follows. No one bakes bread, no one pours beer, no one recites the required words. The disaster is not only physical, it is administrative. The channels of provision to the gods are cut. The routines that structured every day in the temple are suspended, and with them the habits that defined how the Anunnaki lived among humans. In one well-known scene, after the waters recede and a first post-flood sacrifice is set up, the gods gather like flies around the smoke, drawn not by spectacle but by the return of what had been missing. Cooked meat, fragrant offerings, the scent of restored order. The description is brief, but its implications extend back over everything the earlier tablets have quietly recorded. For the duration of the flood, the divine household went unfed. The kitchens fell silent. The storerooms stood closed. The careful alignment of meals, garments, and duties ceased to function. When activity resumes, the intensity of divine attention to the altar suggests a remembered lack, as though the gods themselves had felt the interruption. Later laments for destroyed cities present a similar picture in a different key. When Yor is said to have fallen, or Nippur to have been abandoned, the texts dwell on the emptied temples. The ovens no longer burn. The offering tables are bare. The doors of the gods' houses hang askew or stand open to the wind. No one sweeps the courtyards. No one replaces worn garments. The gods are described as having left their dwellings, or as sitting in desolate sanctuaries, their people gone. Again, the absence of provision and service is central. A city's collapse is registered in the termination of daily acts that once surrounded the divine resident with food, clothing, and attention. The flood and the later destructions thus share a quiet structural similarity. Both are remembered as moments when the shared economy of dependence between humans and gods is broken. In normal times, as the administrative records suggest, the Anunnaki's presence is sustained through a continuous flow of goods and care. When catastrophe intervenes, that flow stops. The texts do not frame this as a simple punishment. Although divine anger is sometimes invoked, they present it as a fact. The channels are severed, the routines forgotten or impossible to perform, and both human and divine ways of living are altered as a result. What stands out is how restoration is described. After the flood, sacrifices resume. After the destruction of a city, later kings speak of bringing back the gods, rebuilding their houses, re-establishing offerings. The language is almost technical. Altars are reset according to established measurements. Kitchens are refitted. Storerooms are replenished. Rituals are performed in the former manner. The aim is not to invent new practices, but to reconnect a broken system. The Anunnaki's diet and dwelling are treated as constants to which one must return, even after the most severe disruptions. In these accounts, humans appear as the agents of restoration, but not as originators. The knowledge of how to feed and house the gods is presented as something preserved, either in memory or in written instruction, and then applied again when circumstances allow. The flood does not erase the pattern. The destruction of a temple does not erase the idea of how a divine residence should function. The texts imply continuity of expectation. Once conditions permit, the gods will once again be offered the same kinds of food, the same patterns of care, within rebuilt walls. Catastrophe, then, serves to highlight the dependence of the Anunnaki's lived presence on human institutions, without resolving the question of priority. If the gods suffer when offerings cease, that suggests a reliance on human action. Yet the rituals and arrangements reinstated afterward are treated as responses to an already valid, pre-existing order associated with the gods themselves. The flood and the ruins expose the fragility of the system, but they also frame its restoration as obedience to something older than the disaster. This double perspective reinforces the quiet ambiguity running through the records. On one hand, the divine lifestyle, regular meals, secured housing, appropriate clothing, defined tasks seems entirely contingent on the functioning of human-managed structures. On the other hand, the same texts insist that these structures conform to patterns associated with the gods, patterns thought of as received rather than devised. The flood and the laments show what happens when the patterns cannot be carried out, but they do not claim that the patterns originate in human creativity alone. In that sense, the memory of catastrophe becomes a way of thinking about inheritance. What survives a flood or a city's fall is not the physical temple or the unbroken sequence of offerings, but the expectation of how such things should be arranged once rebuilding is possible. The Anunnaki's way of living, as recorded in the aftermath, is less an innovation prompted by crises than a recovery of familiar forms. The scribes who write of restoration speak as if they are rejoining a conversation, not starting a new one. Yet the interruptions leave their mark. Each rebuilding introduces slight changes in layout, in the names of officials, in the specific formulations of prayers. The broad pattern is preserved, but its details shift, and these shifts are then carried forward as the new inheritance. Catastrophe both confirms the resilience of the underlying framework and serves as a point where that framework can be quietly adjusted. The gods are fed again, housed again, clothed again, but never in exactly the same rooms or by exactly the same hands. If the moments when offerings cease and resume reveal how closely the Anunnaki, his daily life, was tied to human continuity, what do they suggest about how later generations understood the origins of the very patterns they were so carefully restoring? Some later texts frame the origins of divine and human arrangements in a single continuous movement, rather than a sharp beginning. In certain Sumerian narratives, the earliest time is described as one in which bread was not yet baked and beer was not yet brewed, a period before the regularization of food, work, and worship. The transition to the world known to the scribes is marked not by the sudden appearance of new practices, but by their gradual establishment, as if they were being brought into alignment with a pattern already implicit in the presence of the gods. The emergence of offerings, temples, and service is described less as invention and more as recognition and organization. King lists and foundation inscriptions contribute to this sense of continuity. When rulers of the early dynastic and your three periods claim to have established or organized offerings for the Anu, they often add that they did so according to the ancient rites, or as in former days. Even when no detailed record of those earlier rites survives, the phrase places their actions within a line of transmission. The king does not claim to have devised new meals or new forms of service for the gods. He presents himself as restoring what had lapsed, as retrieving from memory or archive a way of living with the divine that predates his own reign. Scribal practice reinforces this attitude. School tablets from Old Babylonian Nippur, for example, preserve copies of older hymns and offering lists, sometimes in archaeological script. The act of copying is explicitly framed as learning the tablets of the past. In such settings, The description of what the gods receive, where they dwell, and how they are served becomes part of a curriculum and inherited knowledge. The students are not encouraged to question why the Anunnaki eat or how their houses should be laid out. They are trained to reproduce texts that assume these arrangements and to carry them forward into their own administrative work. Even when new cities rise or new dynasties take power, the basic forms of divine provision tend to be presented as already given. A ruler of a later period might elevate his city as patron god or rename an older deity, but the practices through which that god is fed and housed follow recognizable templates. The building inscriptions emphasize that measurements were taken, foundations were laid on firm ground, doors were hung correctly, and offerings were made abundant, all in language that echoes earlier records. Change appears as reallocation within a stable system rather than as replacement of the system itself. This does not mean that the scribes and rulers imagined no beginning at all. Some texts speak of a time before kingship descended from heaven, before cities and temples were founded. Yet when they describe the establishment of those institutions, they tend to do so in terms that suggest revelation or descent rather than human invention. Kingship is said to have come down. Cultic regulations are said to have been shown or fixed by the gods. In this telling, the organization of offerings and the pattern of temple life are not conceived as human solutions to human problems, but as arrangements granted or disclosed by the very beings who benefit from them. As centuries pass, the accumulation of documents, hymns, contracts, building records creates a layered archive of how the Anunnaki were thought to live among humans. Later generations reading or copying these texts would have encountered a dense web of assumptions that gods eat, that they dwell in houses, that they wear garments, that they exercise specific tasks, that disruptions to this order are temporary, and that restoration means returning to established ways. The origin of these patterns is left in a kind of deliberate vagueness, somewhere between divine instruction and ancestral precedent. From within this perspective, civilization appears less as a sequence of breakthroughs and more as the careful maintenance and adjustment of an inherited arrangement linking gods and humans and shared routines. The forms of feeding, housing, clothing, and serving the Anunnaki are preserved, rephrased, and reapplied rather than repeatedly reinvented. Yet because the earliest stages of this process are remembered only in formulaic phrases about former days and ancient rites, the question remains open. Did the scribes and builders think of themselves as executing a way of life first practiced by the gods or as giving lasting shape to patterns that had grown gradually out of their own long experience? In the Sumerian language, the verbs for consumption form a narrow but telling set. The rugio means to eat. To partake, used for both a labor taking his ration of bread and a deity receiving an offering at the altar. When a tablet states that a statue eats the presented food, it employs this same term, without qualification or shift to a more abstract vocabulary. The gods eat as humans eat. They partake as humans partake. The action links the two without ceremony or explanation. This lexical continuity extends to libation rituals. The verb na describes the pouring of liquid, whether it is beer set before a king at a banquet or beer poured for Enlil in his temple. Priests na for the god. The god is said to neigh in acceptance. The term carries no inherent distinction between mortal throat and divine presence. Tablets recording libations list the volume poured 3 jugs, 6 liters and name the recipient, treating the act as a measurable transfer akin to any other distribution from temple stores. The language assumes that the god engages with the liquid in a manner continuous with human engagement. Service verbs follow the same pattern. The term dag means to pour out, to distribute, to measure, applied equally to oil given to workers and oil given to statues. A priest dug the god's portion. The goddess described as receiving what is dug in festival descriptions. This verb chains together the sequence. Grain is ground, dough is kneaded, bread is baked, then dug before the deity. The final step integrates the god into the same grammatical structure as every prior human action in the process. No special terminology marks the moment of divine involvement. Quantities reinforce this grammatical leveling. Measures like the ban for grain, the sila for oil, the kosh jug for beer appear unchanged whether the recipient is human or unknown. A text might record 10 sila of flour for the hands of the workers on one line, 12 sila for the mouth of Ningarasu on the next. The units remain standard, The body parts, referenced mouth, hand remain. Concrete. The scribe does not adjust the lexicon to accommodate a different order of being. The gods are accommodated within the existing terminology of need and provision. Even the passive constructions carry this implication. When a tablet notes that beer was eaten by the god, the phrasing mirrors entries for human consumption elsewhere in the archive. The same grammatical voice describes a priest eating his evening ration or a deity receiving a morning offering. In Sumerian, the structure does not distinguish categories of consumer. It records transactions in a shared syntax, as though the act of eating, regardless of who performs it, follows the same rules of description and accounting. Colophons and summary lines sometimes group divine and human recipients together. Provisions for the house of the god: 20 loaves for Enki, 10 for the singers, 5 for the gatekeeper. The list flows without break or subcategory. The god's share leads by virtue of rank, but inhabits the same linguistic container as the portions for temple staff. This bundling suggests that scribes conceived of the temple household as a single economic unit, its members differentiated by status, but united by the verbs of distribution and consumption. Offerings tied to speech acts show further overlap. When a prayer or hymn accompanies food presentation, the verb tuk to cause, to take, to provide, links the human speaker to the divine recipient. The priest took the offering while speaking, the gad tuk, through presence. Later, Akkadian glosses on Sumerian terms occasionally attempt to distinguish levels of meaning, but the original Sumerian texts resist such refinement. The root simplicity of Jiyu-na, Dug persists across contexts, carrying no trace of hierarchy in its morphology. The direction of service verbs also blurs boundaries. Priests serve the table of the god, using lugal in the sense of attending a superior, but some hymns reverse the image. Higher gods are said to serve lower ones with food or drink, employing the same root. The relational structure provider to recipient remains constant whether the flow moves between humans and gods or among the Anunnaki themselves. The language encodes service as a universal grammar, not a unidirectional obligation. Numbers and classifiers add precision without abstraction. When a text specifies 1 ox for the eating of An, the classifier E's marks it as livestock suitable for consumption, identical to markers for human feasts. Fish offerings carried the classifier Ku, measured by count or weight, presented to both mortal banquets and divine altars. The nouns and their modifiers form a lexicon of concrete particulars: barley loaf, date beer, fat-tailed sheep. That describes apply without alteration to divine contexts. This terminological consistency appears deliberate. Sumerian lacks a dedicated semantic field for divine eating or sacred consumption. When later traditions introduce specialized vocabulary, it often represents Akkadian overlay on Sumerian foundations. The original texts, closer to the temple's daily operations, treat the Anunnaki needs through the same verbal and nominal inventory used for every dependent within the institutional household. Eating, serving, pouring, these are not reimagined for gods. They are extended upward. The scribes who shaped these terms sat in the same world they described. Their language reflects not theological innovation but practical continuity. To name the god's meal was to name a real transaction, measured and recorded like any other. The verbs bind divine presence to human action without needing to explain the connection. They assume Italiano. If the verbs of eating and serving treat gods and humans within the same grammatical frame, what happens when those same terms govern the timing of offerings aligned? Not 2 human clocks, but 2 observed patterns in the sky above the temple. Alignment of offerings with celestial patterns begins with the simplest observations recorded in temple calendars. When the moon stands full above the flat roofs of Nippur or Rook, texts direct that extra loaves and beer be placed before Enlil, marked as for the night of fullness. The timing is not arbitrary. The phase of the moon governs the increase or decrease in provisions, as though the god's appetite or presence waxes and wanes with the visible light. Scribes note these moments without explanation, treating the sky's rhythm as the default schedule for the temple kitchen. Lunar cycle structure, the monthly round of service. On the first visibility of the new crescent, called the Tisag, in Sumerian, document small offerings of flour and water precede larger meals as the light grows. By the 15th day, when the disk is complete. The texts specify doubled portions. Twice the meat, twice the oil, twice the jars of beer. The pattern inverts after full moon. As the light fades toward the last crescent, provisions taper. The god receives less as the night grows darker. This ebb and flow suggests that the Anunnaki's daily sustenance was imagined as responsive to the same celestial clock that guided planting, harvest, and flood retreat for the human community below. Annual festivals lay a solar and seasonal timing onto this lunar base. The Akichu ceremony, tied to the equinox and barley ripening, brings offerings of first fruits and newborn lambs to the gods of each city. Texts from your record that Nana receives dates and emmer wheat precisely when those crops appear in the fields surrounding the temple estate. The sky does not dictate the ingredients those come from earth, but it sets the moment when they must be delivered. The goddess table is prepared according to a calendar that coordinates human labor with observed positions of sun, moon, and stars. Star risings add further precision. When the Pleiades climb before dawn in late autumn, tablets direct offerings to deities associated with grain storage, as though the constellation signals the gods' need for secured provisions against winter scarcity. The rising of Sirius or Orion marks periods of intensified libations to water gods like En, coinciding with the seasonal pulse of rivers and canals. These alignments are not framed as symbolic correspondences. The texts present them as operational necessities on TS night. When that star appears, the god receives this measure of oil or beer. The scribe records compliance, not interpretation. Agricultural cycles reinforce the celestial frame. The month, named for the barley harvest geeking cut triggers, festival meals of new grain for Ninhursag and other earth deities. Flood season, when the rivers swell under late summer stars, brings fish and river fowl to temple altars. The gods' portions rise and fall with the land's productivity, but the timing remains tethered to sky events. The text might note that on the day the star of the flood stands in the east, 10 fish for Enki. The sequence implies that the Anunnaki's living rhythm was calibrated to patterns visible to all, priests and farmers alike. Temple orientation embeds this awareness in architecture. Many shrines face southeast, toward the path of sunrise, or align with the equinox path across the horizon. Doorways frame specific celestial events, so that light falls on the cult statue at calculated moments. When the winter solstice sun strikes the inner niche of a Nippersella, offerings laid that morning are said to be for the turning of the year. The building itself participates in the schedule, channeling sky time into the gods' enclosed space. Walls and foundations thus extend the celestial calendar into the daily routine of feeding and serving. Priestly rotas reflect the same discipline. Shifts for bakers, brewers, and offering bearers rotate according to lunar phases, with specialists assigned to full moon night or eclipse watch. During an eclipse, when moon or sun darkens unexpectedly, emergency offerings are mandated. Doubled bread, extra oil, recitations until light returns. The texts treat these as heightened moments in the god's day, interruptions that demand immediate restoration of normal provision. The sky's anomalies thus intensify the regular pattern rather than breaking it. Later astronomical records, though Akkadian in language, preserve Sumerian precedents. Diarists from Babylon note that equinox offerings to an unit or festival meals for Nabu follow star positions, unchanged from your 3 calendars. The continuity suggests that scribes across generations copied not only the lists of foods, but the celestial triggers that governed their presentation. The Anunnaki's meals were not detached from time. They were emplaced within a measured sequence of sky events, inherited and standardized long before the documents were written. This celestial embedding raises a subtle point about scale. Human days follow sun and moon for practical reasons. Light for work, seasons for crops. The gods' offerings follow the same markers, but in temple quantities, prepared through institutional labor. The implication is that the divine rhythm operates on the same temporal frame as human life, only amplified through the resources of the city. No separate divine clock is proposed. The Anunnaki parte, when the moon fills, when stars rise, when rivers crest, precisely. When humans also eat, store, and prepare. The records never state why sky patterns dictate divine meals. They assume the connection, recording it as a fixed sequence. On this night, this god, this portion, to the priests watching the horizon from temple roofs, the alignment would have appeared a pattern linking God, sky, and city in unbroken regularity. If the timing of offerings was so precisely tied to celestial and seasonal observation, what role did the systems of measurement play in ensuring that those portions reached the gods in exact and standardized form? Standardized measures emerge early in Mesopotamian records, appearing not as theoretical ideals, but as tools shaped by the demands of temple provisioning. A small clay tablet from the late 4th millennium, recovered from the Uruk 4 levels, already bears incised lines, marking capacities for grain and liquid protosila units, of roughly 1 liter each. By the early dynastic period, these develop into a nested system, 60 silaforum 1 ban tangur, equal 30 ban. The ratios are consistent across sites. When a text specifies 3 gura barley for the table of Enlil, the quantity translates precisely into the same volume allocated to 100 workers elsewhere on the same tablet. The god's portion operates within human scales, not beyond them. Weights follow similar logic. Stone weights inscribed with marking 60 shekels to the mina, 60 mina, to the talantapier. In temple storerooms, alongside sets of bronze balances. Offering lists use these for meat, wool, and oil. A shoulder of mutton, 5 mana, for ningasu machas, the weight standard for elite human rations. No special divine weights exist. The same stones balance the goddess cut of meat as balance the priest's evening meal. Tablets occasionally note discrepancies. Short ones sila with penalties assigned, indicating that precision mattered equally when filling jars for deities or for laborers. Mathematical tablets from scribal schools demonstrate how these systems were taught through problems tied directly to cult practice. Exercises calculate total offerings when a god receives 12 loaves daily, doubled on full moon nights, tripled at equinox. The operation's multiplication by 60, division into portions. Adjustment for festival days mirror the arithmetic of field yields, or workforce rations. Solutions end with totals in gur or mina, ready for administrative use. The numbers governing divine meals are trained into scribes as practical skills, not abstract theory. The gods' table drives exercises that stabilize the entire economy. Temple storerooms preserve physical evidence of enforcement. Rows of jars calibrated to exact gur capacity, their rims marked with incised lines, stand beside sets of weights sealed with cylinder seals. Administrative texts record monthly checks. Vessels conform to standard, weights verified. When a king like Gudea boasts of building a temple, he includes lines about fixing the measures and establishing true balances within its walls. The implication is that the goddess house requires not just food, but the instruments to measure it correctly. Without standard units, the routines of provision collapse. Ratios extend this precision into distribution. Divine portions often follow fixed proportions relative to the temple household. 1/3, 1/2 recorded in fraction tables on school tablets. A text might state, total barley from fields, 1/5 to the god, remainder to men. The math ensures the Anunnakis share without depleting human needs. When festivals demand excess, calculations adjust upward while preserving the base ratio. The system treats the god as first recipient within a larger allocation, measured through operations that any trained scribe could perform. Conversion between dry and liquid measures shows further sophistication. 1 gur of grain yields a predictable volume of flour or beer, tabulated in reference lists. Oil from sesame follows equivalent scales. These equivalences allow offerings to substitute when one commodity runs short. No oxen, then 5 gura barley for the same eating. The flexibility rests on metrological stability. The god accepts alternatives, but always in exact correspondence to established norms. Scribes record such exchanges without comment, as routine adjustments within a trusted framework. Physical standards master weights. Master jars appear in royal inscriptions as royal gifts to temples. Shulgi of Yura claims to have set up the standard gore in the house of Nana, casting it in bronze for permanence. Such objects function as anchors, against which local measures are checked. Deviations invite correction or royal intervention. The king positions himself as guarantor of the system that feeds the gods, linking political authority to metrological accuracy. Temples thus become nodes in a network of verified standards radiating from royal centers. Scribal errors in measurement texts carry quiet consequences. A tablet noting overfill by 2 sila, penalty to the measurer, suggests that mistakes in divine portions were not symbolic lapses but infractions against institutional order. Precision ensured not just sufficiency, but propriety. The god received neither too little nor excess, but the exact share due by custom. Over centuries, this discipline of measure radiates outward, stabilizing markets, trade, and taxation beyond temple walls. The development of sexagesimal notation reinforces this foundation. Bas-60 arithmetic, visible already in proto-cuneiform accounts, allows compact recording of large quantities and fractions. 6/10 of a sila. 6/10 of a data system aligns time, volume, and weight. In shared notation, when a text computes offerings for 60 days, total 12 gore daily, the calculation flows seamlessly. The Anunnaki's sustenance, measured across lunar months or festival cycles, benefits from a numeracy tuned to celestial and agricultural scales. Through this lens, standardization appears less as administrative convenience and more as a necessity born from sustaining divine presence. The measures govern not only what reaches the altar but how the entire flow of goods from field to kitchen to shrine is quantified and accountable. Scribes and kings treat the system as inherited, refining its instruments while preserving its ratio. No text claims invention. They record maintenance of a framework that makes regular provision possible. Yet if measures ensured exact portions for the gods, how did legal structures protect those portions from human dispute or neglect? Once they left the scales and entered the ritual domain, law collections from Mesopotamia often treat temple provisions not as pious extras, but as protected obligations. In the prologue to the Laws of Yonama the king states that he established regular offerings for the gods and secured their bread and beer, placing cult support alongside justice for widows and orphans as part of correct rule. The text frames this not as innovation, but as restoration of a proper state of affairs. Offerings had lapsed or become irregular, and the king, as tasked, was to refix them as a stable entitlement within the legal and administrative order. Individual laws touch the temple sphere more quietly. Clauses concerning theft or misuse of property sometimes specify harsher penalties. When the goods in question belong to a sanctuary, taking an ox from a temple herd, diverting grain earmarked for offerings, or altering accounts of cultic income are treated as more serious offenses than equivalent acts against private property. Even when the preserved texts are fragmentary, the pattern is visible. What feeds the god's house falls under a stricter protection. The law does not separate sacred and economic. It intensifies enforcement where both coincide. Contracts and legal documents from cities such as Ura-Nippur reinforce this protective net. When individuals endow fields or flocks for the life of the king to particular temples, the tablets often stipulate that the yield is to supply specific offerings in perpetuity. Daily bread for a god, oil for lamps, beer for a monthly festival. Witness lists and seal impressions tie the arrangement to the community's legal fabric. If heirs or officials attempt to reclaim or divert these assets, they violate not only a religious obligation, but a binding legal agreement. The gods' meals are thus underwritten by enforceable rights attached to land and labor. Some boundary stones and foundation inscriptions state explicitly that encroaching on temple land or reducing its income invites divine sanction. A ruler might declare that whoever diminishes these offerings, may the god cut off his name. The threat sits beside recorded tax exemptions and fixed quotas, indicating that legal and theological pressures work together. The offerings themselves are not detailed again. The inscriptions assume that lists and calendars already define them. What matters here is the guarantee that they cannot be reduced without consequence. Within the temple, internal regulations handle more routine risks. Administrative texts allude to oaths taken by storehouse keepers and offering priests, binding them to honest handling of food and goods destined for the shrines. If discrepancies appear missing grain, short measures of oil investigations can lead to restitution or dismissal. The language used is similar to that applied to other institutional offices, but where divine provisions are concerned, the margin for tolerated errors seems smaller. The god's portion is treated as the point where negligence becomes especially visible. Royal inscriptions often connect legal order and cultic order directly. A king claims to have established justice in the land and regular offerings in the temples, pairing the two as parallel outcomes of his authority. To rule well is to ensure that courts function and that gods receive their due. Later copies of these inscriptions, used in scribal education, preserve the association, law, and ritual appear together as markers of a correct, inherited arrangement rather than as separate spheres of activity. When cities fall or dynasties change, new rulers sometimes issue decrees reaffirming temple privileges. They confirm existing land grants, remissions of certain taxes, and fixed quantities of grain or animals owed to specific cults. Such decrees rarely alter the substance of offerings. They reassert the mechanisms that protect them. The language of restoring or renewing implies that the pattern of provision predates the decree. The legal act is framed as alignment with an accepted norm, not the creation of a new regime of feeding the gods. Over time, this interplay of law and cult creates a layered structure. Land charters, court decisions, contracts, and royal proclamations converge on the same practical outcome, that food and goods set aside for the Anunnaki reach their destinations without being siphoned off. No text claims that law invented the gods' diet. Instead, legal structures are presented as tools for safeguarding what is already assumed to be owed. The meals and maintenance of divine households remain conceptually prior. Statutes and decrees follow to prevent human interference. Yet even as rules and penalties accumulate, the sources never fully resolve a quiet tension. If the gods depend on legally protected flows of goods, and those laws are human instruments, does that mean the Anunnaki's way of living is ultimately contingent on human systems? Or are those systems themselves understood as part of a larger order that the gods were thought to have set in place? Medical and ritual texts from Mesopotamia sometimes describe the care of divine statues in terms remarkably close to the care of human bodies. A god's image is washed with water drawn from specific, often named sources, then dried and anointed with oils whose ingredients are itemized in the same manner as ointments used for patients. The procedures are recorded as sequences of actions: rubbing, perfuming that, ecotherapeutic routines, suggesting that the statue was treated as a body requiring regular maintenance rather than as an inert object. Incense formulas reinforce this impression. Tablets, list, resins, woods, and aromatics combined in precise proportions for the nose of the god, or for the mouth of the god, using language similar to that employed for fumigations in healing rituals. The smoke is directed toward the statue in controlled amounts at specified times of day, as if to cleanse and protect an internal system. No text states that the deity suffers illness as humans do, yet the repeated use of purifying substances implies an awareness that divine presence, like human health, needed to be shielded from corruption, stagnation, or pollution. In rituals of renewal, such as those performed when a statue had been damaged or neglected, the sequence becomes more elaborate. The image is sometimes symbolically brought to life, again through rites that include opening the mouth, touching the eyes and ears with particular mixtures, and reanointing the limbs. The same verbs that appear in medical incantations for restoring speech, vision, or hearing in human surface. Here is part of the divine treatment. The gods are not declared vulnerable in the way humans are, but their cult images undergo procedures that assume vulnerability and the need for correction. Oils and unguents used on statues are tracked in administrative texts with the same care as those reserved for high-status patients. Ingredients such as sesame oil, cedar oil, and fragrant resins are weighed, combined, and consumed in quantities that would be extravagant for ordinary people. The mixture becomes a concentrated form of care, aimed at a single body that stands for an entire divine household. To apply these substances is to perform an ongoing act of preservation, one that acknowledges both the material of the statue and the intangible presence it represents. These compositions never settle the question of perspective. From one angle, humans appear as servants created to relieve the gods and maintain their way of living. From another, the arrangement can be read as a projection of human social structures upward, casting the gods as the ultimate beneficiaries of a pattern already familiar in royal and temple hierarchies. The texts themselves maintain a careful ambiguity, presenting the service as both divinely instituted and deeply woven into human practice. If the stories that explain service leave this tension unresolved, and the records of daily life show humans maintaining divine households through inherited routines, then when later scribes looked back at their own role in copying, adjusting, and preserving these arrangements, did they see themselves as repeating a pattern given once at the beginning, or as quietly reshaping how the Anunnaki were understood to live with each new tablet they pressed into clay. In many tablet collections, the work of scribes appears not only in what they wrote, but in how they handled older texts. Some tablets from Old Babylonian Nippur, for example, preserve Sumerian hymns and offering lists that were already centuries old when they were cooked, sometimes in deliberately archaic signs that imitate earlier styles. The colophons of such tablets may note that the composition is from long ago or according to an ancient tablet, implying that the scribe understood himself as part of a chain, preserving rather than originating the description of how gods were to be fed, housed, and honored. CDLI Sook's scribal school exercises reveal the same attitude in miniature. Students copied short extracts from god lists, offering series and ritual instructions over and over, sometimes on small practice tablets, sometimes on larger ones intended for archival use. Errors were corrected, variant sign forms introduced, and alternative wordings occasionally adopted, yet the overall structure remained consistent. The work was repetitive, but not mechanically so. Each act of copying offered a chance for slight adjustment of spelling, of arrangement, of emphasis within a framework that the school treated as given. Some tablets preserved double or triple versions of the same text on opposite sides, or in parallel columns, allowing comparison. Differences are often minor. A god's epithet expanded, a measure of grain slightly altered, an additional line praising a temple inserted. To modern eyes, these look like editorial changes. To the scribes, they may have been acts of alignment, bringing a local practice into harmony with a more widely accepted pattern, or clarifying details in light of current usage. The way the gods were said to live did not stand outside time. It passed through these small decisions. Inventories and shelf lists from later periods show that temples kept older tablets as reference, sometimes alongside newer copies. Notes indicate that certain boards were old writing or not to be altered. Others lack such markings and show more variation when later copies are made. This suggests that scribes distinguished between texts that defined core arrangements, basic offering sequences, fundamental god lists, and those where some flexibility was allowed. Even so, the act of selection, what to copy, what to leave on the shelf, necessarily shaped which details of the Anunnaki's daily life remained vivid and which faded. Personal names and titles of scribes occasionally appear in the colophons, followed by phrases such as wrote and checked, or learned and deposited. The pairing of writing and checking implies that accuracy was a conscious goal, yet the very need for checking acknowledges the possibility of divergence. When these same individuals also served as temple bureaucrats, their understanding of how the gods lived was informed both by inherited texts and by the practical realities of kitchens, storerooms, and court procedures. What they recorded on clay was therefore a blend of memory, precedent, and current practice. Over generations, the cumulative effect of such careful copying and occasional adjustment was to stabilize the image of divine life while allowing it to absorb subtle changes. New deities could be added to lists, new festivals inserted into calendars, new cities attached to old gods, all without overtly breaking with the inherited pattern. The Anunnaki continued to receive bread, beer, meat, garments, and care according to established forms. But the exact configurations of names, measures, and sequences slowly shifted. Each tablet fixed one moment in this ongoing process. The scribes themselves seem to have considered their role conservative rather than creative. They invoked phrases like according to its original or as it has always been, even when evidence of variation shows that no single, unchanging original existed in practice. Their self-understanding leaned toward preservation, yet the physical record reveals their quiet influence. By choosing which versions to copy, how to arrange lines, and when to update terminology, they shaped the way later generations would conceive the everyday existence of the gods. This dynamic leaves a final, unresolved question at the heart of the archive. If the meals, houses, garments, duties, and care of the Anunnaki reach later periods only through the hands of successive scribes, then to what extent is the divine way of living that can now be reconstructed a reflection of an original, stable pattern, and to what extent is it the accumulated result of many small acts of remembering, correcting, and rephrasing by those who believed they were only passing on what had always been true?